All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. So this is part of our spring talks, our 350 Connecticut spring talks. We Our first one was in, I believe, February. It was on climate and incarceration. And we had a speaker named Barbara Fair. She is from Stop Solidarity, Connecticut. And then our next talk last month was on the uh, protests that occurred in Panama around the largest copper mines in one of the largest copper mines in Central America. And our speaker, Jose Cambra, he's a teacher in Panama and heavily involved in the protests. He gave a really wonderful talk on the history of Panama and how this movement came to be. And we actually recorded that one as well, and that's on our website right now if you want to watch it, which is 350ct.org. But today we are talking about the state of the labor climate movement. We have an incredible speaker, Jeremy Brecher. He is the author of Strike Commentaries on Solidarity and Survival. He's a part of the Labor Network for Sustainability, and he will talk about the growing effects by unions to take climate action and what that should mean for our strategy today as climate activists and as a climate group here in Connecticut. And before I turn it over to him, um, I'll just remind everyone we do have Spanish translation available. Um, so if you need that, please select the Spanish channel. Um, and after our talk and discussion, we will be holding a brief 350. Okay, so we do have a Spanish speaker coming on soon, Chris says. So anyway, after the talk, we will hold a brief meeting to discuss a possible new forum for this summer. So if you'd like to stay and talk about that with us, please do. The whole thing shouldn't run more than an hour or so. Um, okay, I will hand it over to Jeremy. Thank you so much for being here.
Great. Well, thanks for having me and for organizing this. Am I coming through okay? Can you hear? Okay, good.
Loud and clear.
Okay. Somebody signal if sometimes the technology goes awry here, so somebody signal me if there's a problem. I've been involved with trying to create a labor climate movement and draw together the trade union movement and environmentalists and climate activists and climate justice activists for a dozen or more years. And so I've had an opportunity to watch the development of this budding but not always smooth romance between these two forces over quite a long period of time. And I work, as was mentioned, with the Labor Network for Sustainability. I edit their newsletter, which gives me an opportunity to look at and cover a lot of the things that are going on in the labor movement around climate issues, and conversely, ways that the climate and environmental movements are relating to labor. I'm also have been from the beginning a board member of the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs, which, if you don't know it, it's an organization you should be familiar with. It's a coalition of unions and religious and community and environmental groups that has been taking quite a leading role here in Connecticut on bringing labor and environmental and climate activists and communities together, and is playing quite a big role on shaping climate policy in the state at this point. And finally, I have just finished a book called the Green New Deal from Below, which is a survey of uh, a very surprisingly wide range of activities at a community and state and local level around basically the objectives of the Green New Deal, protecting the climate through creating good jobs and addressing issues of racial and climate and economic justice. So that's kind of where I'm coming from on this. And I know that we're uh, all probably the people on this call are almost all climate activists of one kind or another. But I'm happy to see there are also a number of trade union activists who are here. And I want to say that I think fundamentally uh, these are not two different groups. We all have to make a living and we all have to live on this planet. And so I think more and more people are coming to realize that this is, we are all both affected by the climate and affected by the problems of the world of work. So um, the basic thing I want to say is that labor and the labor movement is changing on the question of climate. And I think it's very important both for trade unionists to be aware of those changes and for climate activists who are interested in reaching out to labor to be aware of those changes. The leading environmental publication, GRIST, wrote for its year-end summary, in 2023, organized labor became core to the climate movement. The year was marked by symbiosis between labor and climate movements. Now, I guess the first question is, why is that news? Why isn't that always been the case? And we have to start by recognizing the long-standing ambivalence that environmental groups and labor groups have had towards each other's issues and towards each other. Sometimes that ambivalence has gone one way, and we've had good labor community environmental cooperation. At other times, it hasn't gone so well, and there's been outright conflict, sometimes even violent conflict between some workers and some environmental and climate activists. So that's what we're coming out of. There are many reasons for that, and I'm not going to go into the whole history of it here, but very much at the core of the conflict, but also of the potentials for cooperation, lies the issue of jobs. Now, the basic reality, and it can't be said too many times, is that climate protection will create far more jobs than it will eliminate. And millions of jobs will be created by a serious climate policy and serious climate investment. And hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of jobs are already being created by, for example, the climate aspects, climate parts of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act, the very large Biden administration industrial policy act is putting ultimately billions of dollars into climate production, and that is creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. So that's the big picture. However, effective climate protection will also require a managed decline in fossil fuel burning, extraction, transportation, and that decline will lead to some fossil fuel jobs being eliminated. and the people who are in those jobs are at risk of having to pay the price. Um, so that is the reason that, principal reason that unions are hesitant about climate protection, and that many workers worry that their jobs might be put at risk by climate policies. It's important to keep that in mind as a completely reasonable concern that any of us would have if we were in that situation. And to keep in mind that the idea that just because somebody happens to be in a fossil fuel related job, if it's not just that they should have to pay the price for what we all need, all citizens, all people, and all people of the world, which is a transition rapidly away from fossil fuel economy toward a renewable energy system. So that is an area that has been marked by a great deal of conflict. Often, trade unionists, especially at a leadership level, have said, well, we're in favor of green jobs. We think it would be great to expand the number of green jobs. And that's fine. But we can't cut the jobs in the fossil fuel industry. We're going to fight that tooth and nail. And the problem is, it's a good thing to create green jobs, but they are not in themselves going to reduce the production and consumption of fossil fuels. And that's what's destroying the climate. It's the greenhouse gases produced by burning fossil fuels that are overwhelmingly responsible for the climate catastrophe that I was going to say we're facing, but that we're right in the middle of. So there's a solution that's been advocated by many people in the labor movement and in the climate movement. It goes by the name of just transition, that there needs to be a transition to fossil-free energy and a fossil-free economy, but that transition has to be a just one in the sense that it does not put the burden of that transition on groups of people who are going to be affected by it, either because they're fossil fuel workers or because they live in communities that are dependent on fossil fuel industries. And so we need to have a just transition that will see that the needs of those people are taken care of, both workers and communities. Organized labor has had some parts of it agreeing with that and adopting it and making that part of its vision of what the future ought to be like. But a very substantial part of the organized labor movement has felt very worried and even threatened by the idea of just transition. Rich Trumka, who was head of the mine workers union for a long time and then was head of the AFL-CIO for a long time, said just transition is just a term for a fancy funeral. So that is the concern and the perspective that has been, I would say, not universal, but predominant within organized labor ever since the rise of the climate crisis. But what we can see today is that labor is changing on climate. And it's changing also on its approach to just transition. And I think that that's what the quote I started with from Grist indicates. That we're in a time of change, and that that's going to affect the way the labor movement and the climate movement need to and can approach each other. Um, there's a couple of reasons for it. One is just recognizing the reality of climate change. And this is something that's happening throughout society and throughout the world, if it comes to that, that it just gets harder and harder to ignore the realities of the climate crisis. And this shows up in poll data. It shows up in resolutions in unions saying, well, we have to do something about the climate crisis. And it is showing up in the fact that even people who have been climate skeptics and deniers of climate change are saying, oh, yes, it's real. And then, but, we have to do this, we can't do that. And specifically, well, we can't take the kinds of measures and make the kinds of changes that are necessary because all kinds of reasons, but above all, because we'll freeze to death in the dark as the fossil fuel industry normally tries to make us fear. So the second reason is that I think resulting from that, there's a recognition that workers are going to lose jobs. They're going to lose jobs because climate change actually destroys jobs. And whether that's from flooding and destruction and from heat that makes people have to stop work for periods of time, for all kinds of reasons and ways in which climate change is directly a threat to jobs. And also because policies addressing climate change are now inevitable. And it's not as if you could stop them by just saying, well, we're afraid our workers will lose jobs, because there are going to be policies and fossil fuels are going to be largely phased out sooner or later, and probably sooner, both because of their environmental threat and also because renewable energy is almost day by day, certainly month by month, becoming cheaper and cheaper and more rational as an energy supply than fossil fuels. And that is only going to accelerate. So this all makes more union leaders who are paying attention recognize that they can't deal with their members' needs by fighting against climate protection. They have to deal with them by supporting a just transition. And one more factor here, I think, that's not often recognized, but the rise of the idea of the Green New Deal really created a common platform for labor and climate. It put forward the idea that we would do climate protection by policies and strategies that involved just transition and that not only protected workers in the fossil fuel industries, but that would create good jobs and in particular union jobs for workers in the new expanded industries that were going to be necessary to make the transition to a economically just and climate safe economy. And having just finished a book on the Green New Deal from below, I've been amazed. There's been some unions have supported the Green New Deal nationally. Others have either usually tacitly opposed it or stood aloof. But at a local and state and community level, there are hundreds of examples of unions cooperating with environmental groups, community groups, racial and economic justice groups, immigrant groups in local and state coalitions designed to address both jobs issues and climate issues through a what I call a Green New Deal from below. And I think another marker of unions becoming less allergic to just transition and actually less allergic to the idea that we are going to have to shut down some industries and have a managed transition away from fossil fuels was the last big climate demonstration, which was last September in New York, which was endorsed by 30 unions, which is not new. Unions have often endorsed climate demonstrations, not all unions, but some. But what was striking here is that the union, that the call and the policy of the march called on the United States as the world's largest producer of oil and gas to completely and justly transition from renewable sources of energy. No delays, half measures, or false solutions. And it explicitly opposed the Willow Project and the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And as far as I know, those 30 unions that supported that action didn't try to push back, didn't say we can't participate in this because it will lead to fossil fuel job loss. So I think that's another straw in the wind that it's just the reality is setting in that we're going to have to do that, and unions have to find ways to protect their members rather than just trying to stop the move to climate safe energy. Now, union action on climate is going on at many levels. And I'm just going to give a few examples at some different levels. So a big, I would say, exemplary development is among teachers. Both the AFT and the NEA have had for quite a while quite strong policy positions that were passed in their conventions calling for climate protection policies, and eventually the AFT has actually called for schools and for the AFT itself to divest from all fossil fuel investments. There's now a network called the Educators Climate Action Network, which involves unions from workers, rank and file, and local unions from both AFT and NEA, who are promoting a plan for clean, environmentally safe schools. And this is developing into quite a substantial national campaign, but also with people campaigning in their own schools and their own communities for schools to become 100% fossil free. And I would say that we have in Connecticut, with the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs, an exemplary case of an efforts both in the selected cities and statewide to develop that kind of clean and healthy schools campaign. This is happening even with some of the groups that have been most opposed to climate protection policies. And as I said, the former head of the Mine Workers Union called Just Transition just a fancy funeral. But the United Mine Workers of America is now partnering with an energy startup to build an electric battery factory in West Virginia. It'll employ 350 workers, and the Mine Workers Union will recruit and train dislocated miners to be the factory's first production workers. According to the Secretary Treasurer, We need good union jobs in the coal fields, no matter what industry they are in. This is a start toward putting the tens of thousands of already dislocated coal miners to work in decent jobs in the communities where they live. And I think we're going to see more and more of that kind of move toward acceptance and even support of just transition on the part of unions. Another layer of this are state labor climate groups. And the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs, which I have mentioned before, is actually one of the oldest and best established of them all. I could do a whole other program talking about what it's been doing. It's been central on climate policy for the state. It's been central for uh, job pipelines for projects, climate and renewable energy projects, and for creating labor standards. It supported and passed legislation for including labor standards in a wide range of green jobs and climate protection programs in the state. And I could go on and on, but it's certainly a prime example of a state level program, which is a coalition of unions, environmental groups, environmental justice groups, religious organizations, uh, and community groups, and really quite an exemplary one among the many that are out there and that I've been able to observe. Um, there is a California Labor for Climate Jobs, which has 15 unions. It's interesting, it's all unions, and they have been supporting each other's demands. So, for example, they've been lobbying the legislature and the governor for climate resilient schools and also for heat protections for workers in the wide range of industries in California where heat that's caused by global warming is a direct health threat to farm workers, to factory workers, to delivery workers. And so there's a wide coalition within unions to take a stand on those things, as well as having developed and are fighting for a program for a just transition for California workers as a whole. And there's also unions operating at a city level. So just to take the example of Providence, this March, the city council passed an ordinance requiring that all municipal buildings, including public schools, be carbon neutral by 2040. It has strong labor and equity standards that will create pathways to union jobs in communities that need them most. It was initiated by Climate Jobs Rhode Island, which described in a Providence Journal article as a coalition attempting to marry the interests of laborers and environmentalists. And that's something that's happening at many cities around the country as well. So let me move toward closure here and leave time for discussion by talking about what I think is the biggest breakthrough in my dozen or so years of working on labor and climate. And that is the United Auto Workers strike, which was basically a strike for a just transition, and their Southern organizing campaign, which is a strike which is an organizing effort which has just a just transition to an electrified vehicle fleet and production for an electrified vehicle fleet at the core of its policy and objective. To understand what this is all about, it's necessary to look at what the corporate strategy of the auto industry was. their idea was, well, there's going to be electrification, and there's, in fact, with the programs of the Biden administration, there's going to be major subsidies to promote the development of electrification of automobiles and trucks. And we have a strategy to take advantage of that, to break unions and to lower wages while we're making money off this transition to electric vehicles. And that strategy was to open electric vehicle plants and battery plants in low-wage, non-union areas, almost entirely in the South. And that is exactly what they've been doing, and they've invested very, very large amounts of money in doing that. And it's basically a strategy that you could call, and the UAW has called out, as a race to the bottom. And the basic idea is, if they can move that work to low-wage, non-union areas, especially in the South, and lower the wages and deteriorate the working conditions of auto workers there, then that they can use that as leverage to lower the conditions of all auto workers all over the country. And that's exactly what they've been trying to do. Now, the United Auto Workers could have addressed this by saying, let's stop this crazy shift to electric vehicles. Why should we be destroying our jobs in our existing plants? That's what this is doing. We're going to fight tooth and nail. And in fact, in the past, the UAW, like some other unions, has opposed climate protection policies on the grounds that they were job destroyers. Instead, this time they took a completely different tack and demanded the transition to electric vehicles go forward, but demanded that it be a just transition, and that instead of the race to the bottom that the auto companies were trying to foment, there'd be a race to the top in which they would be forced to compete to raise conditions for workers in traditional and electrified auto production. So basically, what they did in the what they dubbed a stand-up strike, sort of new twist on the historical sit-down strikes of the auto industry, was to strike to elevate the conditions of the auto industry workers who were organized now, and then use that as a lever to organize and force elevation of the conditions of workers in the non-union plants. And that is exactly what's happening now. The climate movement could have said, and I think a few years ago probably would have said, much of it, geez, raising the wages of these electric vehicle producing workers and electrical battery and battery producers is going to raise the cost of electric vehicles above that of conventional gas guzzlers, and that's going to slow down the transition to a carbon-free auto industry and economy. They were, and that's exactly what the companies were saying. Oh, this is going to hurt the transition to electric vehicles, and it's bad for the climate. And I'm proud to say that the climate movement would have nothing to do with this, and instead, the 100 climate organizations, including the largest ones, signed a letter of solidarity with UAW workers and joined union picket lines. And they did that because they had come to understand, and it was made clear by the positions taken by the UAW, that this was a strike to make a just transition for the electrification process, and that was essential. And if you had an unjust transition, and the result was to drive the conditions of auto workers down, that would turn workers across the country against climate change protections, climate policies, and they recognized that if climate protection could be shown to be good for workers, which is what the UAW was doing, was the way it approached this question, that would win a whole new wave of support for climate protection. And that's, I think, what we're seeing happening now. It's not universal, but that's the new path that we're on. And what the UAW did was, first of all, to propose a just transition plan for an entire industry, which went way beyond what previous just transition plans and proposals have done, which basically were just protecting a handful of workers who were being hurt by closing of fossil fuel plants and transportation for fossil fuels, and instead put forward a way to reorganize the entire vehicle industry and auto industry on a just transition basis. And the second thing that they did was not just to say, well, this should be government policy, although they definitely did that and forced significant changes in the Biden administration approach to building new electrical vehicle plants, but they also directly impose their demands on employers, using the power of the strike to do that. And I think that is a breakthrough moment in the history of labor climate relations and of labor movement approach to climate issues. So that victory immediately was followed up by an organizing drive, especially in the South, for the ununionized auto plants. If you follow the news, we've seen the first success. The Chattanooga Volkswagen plant, which I believe has had 3 times the company has defeated previous efforts to unionize. It just voted to bring in the UAW. The vote was nearly 2-1 in favor, and it will be a flagship for the rest of organizing the rest of something like 17 non-union auto plants. Next up is the Mercedes plants in Vance, Alabama. There's a vote May 13th to 17th. You can keep your fingers crossed, but it looks very good. And there are a couple of very significant things about that campaign. It is, first of all, almost entirely self-organized. Sean Fain, the head of the UAW, said they organized themselves. We didn't have that much to do with it. Of course, we're supporting them, but the initiative is theirs, and that's great. And I think the union's recognizing that what has to happen basically is workers organizing themselves is itself a step forward in moving toward the kind of labor movement that we need. And the other thing is that it was very much initiated and is very much affected by the great increase in young workers in that plant. And if workers go for the union there, overall in the country, support for unions has increased enormously, but among young people, it's increased exponentially. And if the Vance, Alabama Mercedes plant goes union, that will be a big part of the reason why. So, what are the next steps here? First of all, I think all of us can play a role in supporting this UAW organizing campaign, and we should be working with them. They have reached out to environmental organizations. There is a continuing network of support that grew out of the 100 organizations that supported the strike. I'm proud to say that my organization, Labor Network for Sustainability, has been at the core of that effort. And the union is asking for that kind of support to continue. And I think our environmental organizations can and should do that. And the other thing is other unions can begin making their own plans for just transitions in their own industries. We've got auto as a model, and we've got the green and healthy school plans that are being developed by a wide swath of teachers organizations, including here in Connecticut with the Connecticut Roundtable, and by the Educators Climate Action Network. The Teamsters have developed a multimodal transportation plan, which was a plan for integrating the rail transit, airlines, and truck transit transportation in a way that would move them toward climate safe vehicles. That's unfortunately kind of died back, but it provides enough, shows that you can develop that kind of plan for an industry like the transportation industry. There's a group called the Architecture Lobby that's developing it's made up of designers and architects, and they are developing a just transition plan for the construction industry. I think the next thing we need to do and can do is support the development of just transition plans in every industry and in every union and start implementing them. So I'll stop right there and be eager for discussion and glad to respond to anything that people want to bring up.
Thank you so much. That was very insightful. We appreciate all the work you've been doing and taking the time to come talk to us. So yeah, I'll open it up for questions. If you have a question or comment, just raise your hand or type your name in the chat and I will take a stack. Okay, Evan, go ahead.
Hey, thank you so much for the presentation, Jeremy. I would turn my camera on, but I've been having computer issues with that, so keeping it off. Yeah, I'm a member of Teamsters Local 145 here in Stratford. I just had a couple of questions with regards to like what you were sort of saying about some of the, I guess, like political and economic context behind like the unions taking up the green transition framework, the just transition framework. One was, it sort of sounded like you were saying that like at this point there is necessarily going to be a transition away from fossil fuel production because of like the economic like rationality of that choice, which, you know, if you're thinking in purely terms of economic rationality of like costs and things like that, it does make sense because like, you know, renewables are so much cheaper, but that like really is not what we're seeing. What we're seeing instead is like I think really vastly expanded continuing to expand fossil fuel production, like the LNG fields in Alaska and in the Gulf, new expansion of fossil fuel production in the Gulf, while at the same time there's like blocking investment, like in on the coast here in renewable wind power. So I guess like that's one question is like, what are some of the, I guess, contradictions with regards to like the economic feasibility of like an immediate transition to renewables versus like the reality, which is capital's not investing in it. And then secondly, I think that there's another contradiction with the current like just transition model, and the UAW strike is like really important example, which is that on the one hand, like this was like you said, like a strike for battery workers, battery plant workers, and EV workers. But on the other hand, I think that there are like bigger questions about like why the so-called renewable transition is focusing so much on electric vehicles as opposed to like public transit. Um, and like what sort of like mobilizations can we be building to win back mass public transportation as a main demand for the movement. And then lastly, just very quickly, I'm interested if you have more information about like sort of rank and file initiatives for like green transition, like green policy in the unions, because like I think that there's a lot that like like in California with the steel workers and like environmental groups there, like coming up with like policy initiatives which are very strong around like just transition. But I, just like myself, like being in the Teamsters, like being in or in the shops, like a lot of those discussions don't really trickle down in my experience. And so I'm just wondering like what ways that we have to, help us to expand like that knowledge and things like that, like on a rank and file basis. Thank you.
Great. Well, these are all extremely good points. And one, I think I'll try to comment on them very quickly. But they're all, I think, on target. You're absolutely right about the expansion of fossil fuel production. It's totally horrible. It will only accelerate climate destruction. It is not creating jobs for very many workers, and workers are especially in coal-related industries are losing jobs and are going to lose jobs. In other words, what the basic point that the policies that are being followed now both by industry and by the government are primarily destructive to the climate and to climate protection. But nonetheless, unions who have members in fossil fuel jobs in the United States do find their workers' jobs being threatened and will continue to do so. So the point I was making is that those unions, when they look at reality, say we can't save our members' jobs by somehow halting the change in energy industries. So that was the point I was trying to make. But you're absolutely right, both about the expansion of fossil fuel extraction and burning overall, and also about their efforts to block the expansion of renewables, which are extremely well funded and take a wide range of political forms. Okay, so as far as EVs versus public transit, I think you're also right on target. And my organization, Labor Network for Sustainability, actually has a program on transit, part of whose argument is electric vehicle transition is good and important, but it's only one piece of the picture, and public transit is a central, crucial piece. Also, railroads are a crucial piece. So again, your point is right on target. I think the reason that electric vehicles have been made so essential is basically because that's the strategy that the Biden administration has chosen. It's been very slow to move forward on public transit. I'm not sure. I think if there was I think that so far as I know, the environmental movement is supportive to public transit, but doesn't know how to really put it front and center on the agenda, but it certainly should be. And finally, in the last point, the our approach at LNS is we try to work at every level in the labor movement, and from where it's the opportunity to to persuade higher levels of unions to get on a better track on climate. We try to do that, and we believe in doing that. But fundamentally, we believe that change is going to come from below. And I think the exemplary case, to my knowledge, of rank and file and local level organization is the educator climate action network, which is very much a rank and file and local union based initiative. There's now a similar thing developing in the in Ask Me in the government state and county municipal workers union. And I hope there'll be lots more things along that line. Those are the outstanding ones that I'm aware of at the moment. There's also a lot of informal networks in other industries and unions, but those are the ones that, as far as I know, have actually developed to the point of being kind of formal networks and organizations. And it looks like Chris is next.
I think actually Hutch is.
That
And then
was Hutch.
Oh, hey, Jeremy. Thanks for the presentation today. Really appreciate it. Good to see you. Evan took part of my question, but I'll start with a comment, and then maybe we can expand on it as well. I thought one of the fights that happened last year that really highlighted the connection between climate and labor was the Wabtec strike by UE up near Lake Erie, where they were fighting for like green locomotives, which also brought in the question of mass public transportation and these sort of things. And I thought that was one of the stronger fights that happened along with the UAW. I thought it was really smart that the Labor Network for Sustainability jumped on the opportunity to build solidarity within the climate movement. I was helping organize the labor contingent for the March to End Fossil Fuels as that strike was happening, and that connection was really meaningful. When I went to present it to the climate movement here to participate in it, people were really excited to do that. And alternatively, we got to meet workers from auto workers like Marcy Pedraza in Chicago, who spoke at the Labor Network's conference call that happened, and make those connections. And I think it's really just a really important example. And at the same time, when we were organizing this contingent for a labor contingent at the March to End Fossil Fuels, we got a lot of union endorsements. It was pretty incredible to see, how many union endorsements there actually were for this. But I think it goes to like what Evan said was, we had like the largest teachers union in New York City endorsed and this sort of thing. But it didn't really reflect in the turnout for, rank and file members. We had our Pride Caucus, and our local didn't endorse Teamsters 1150, but our Pride Caucus did. And so I think those discussions are just happening. And my biggest question as a kind of a rank and file, union activist is how can we continue to try to, turn out our coworkers and our members. And I was wondering too if there's, like if the labor network has a like speakers bureau that if we wanted to try to get people to come to our union locals or around the state or around the region, because there might be there's people from other states here that we could plug them into to build meetings at our union locals. But I think the work for the network is important. If there's any upcoming initiatives that the network's doing, I think we'd be happy to hear about it and try to plug into it in some way.
Great. So let me give the website for Labor Network for Sustainability, because everything we do just about shows up there one way or another. So it's www.labor4sustainability.org. labor4sustainability.org. Or if you just put Labor Network for Sustainability into a website, into a search engine, Google or whatever. And just about everything that we know that's going on will show up there. I edit the newsletter and I put in every month what I consider the most significant stories in this area. So if anyone wants to follow it, that's a good way to follow it. I'm glad you mentioned the UE locomotive strike. I actually toured that plant. It was originally the Westinghouse electric plant, Westinghouse air brake plant. And I toured it in 1972. Toured meaning that workers brought me in and I met with some of the union leaders, and they told me what was what in that plant a long, long time before this, but some of the issues were the same. And I'm very glad you mentioned that, because I think their plan for climate safe, low emission or no emission locomotives and building them was a perfect example of what I was talking about when I was saying unions and workers all over can make just transition plans for their own industries. I'd also just mention that there's in another network that cuts across different categories of railroad workers called Railroad Workers United, which actually is another exemplary case of having a just transition plan for a whole industry. So that's another example of showing what it means to go in that direction. And Speakers Bureau, we don't have one now. We have discussed it. LNS staff do a lot of speaking around at union events, so you can always ask if you're going to do something. Just ask. But I think a wider Speakers Bureau, and we're in touch with lots and lots of people who, if we can't do it, here's a good person that we can put you in touch with. So that's kind of the way we're doing it for now. Maybe if there's more demand, we can increase the supply. And next.
Yep, Chris is next.
Thanks so much, Jeremy. It's really good to have a human giving this summary and suggesting the various openings in front of us. I'm going to ask what might be kind of a wilder question, but I mean, one of the things that sparked my imagination during the UAW strike was the demand for a shorter work week without a reduction in pay, or 4-day work week, or various formulations that did raise the question of reducing production without reducing workers' income and livelihood. And it was significant to me because the truth is that the scientists tell us that, we're way over all the marks, and that emergency transition has to include somehow, some way, and I prefer the way of workers' democracy, a actual reduction in production. And it seems to me that the historic, demand of labor for a shorter work week with no reduction in pay actually could provide a place for us to bring that bigger discussion into labor. And since you've been finding ways to bring the bigger discussions into labor for decades, I'm just wondering if you've thought about this, what the scientists tell us is a reality. I mean, it's not only fossil fuel, drilling and power plants and the grid and all that, of course, but all the industries that, from plastics to other industries that produce junk that we don't need, that, are based on planned obsolescence and all that kind of stuff, where dramatic gains could be made in a very short period of time if the working class saw this as part of their task. So I would just be interested in your reaction to that, because I think that was an interesting element, reintroduction of some higher level thinking in the UAW strike. I just had one other similar thing. Something has been happening. There's been a debate in the local Palestine movement about reopening the discussion about conversion. In this case of war plants, because a lot of the youth wanted, to stop production around the issue of Gaza. And a number of key labor activists came here and spoke and reminded people of the importance in the 1980s of the machinists, championing production conversion for human needs. But of course, that wouldn't only apply to war industry, but could apply to a lot of production that is not really the stuff we need for human needs that, if that large discussion began in labor movement. So I was just wondering if you see that as part of the future, if you've thought about ways to begin to popularize or normalize that discussion among labor, and that kind of thing. Our last forum here was this teacher from Panama, and basically a quarter of the country went into the streets, backed fundamentally the unions fighting austerity and the indigenous communities fighting, for preservation of their land. And in that struggle, they all came together, and the workers learned a tremendous amount about what was needed for climate, including the need to challenge a lot of production. So anyway, those are my big picture questions. Thanks very much.
Great. Well, all good points, and a lot to respond to in our time. But let me hit a couple of them quickly. I think that the work hours imposed on American workers has become totally outrageous. It's totally out of line historically, and totally out of line internationally. And basically, not only the hours per week, but also the absence of a destruction of vacations, and just the lack of free time, and the extent to which daily life has been reduced to work and work and work, is an outrageous aspect of what's going on in the last several decades. And it shows up in the statistics. And it also shows up in people, having part-time jobs, but having to have 3 or 4 of them to even begin to make ends meet. So I think raising the, and second thing is the way you get an issue like shorter hours to become something that is real and has some momentum behind it is somebody has to start raising it. So I agree with you completely that even though it's not likely to be a major demand immediately, it was extremely constructive for the UAW to start raising it. And it has a secondary aspect, it always has in places where you have great big plants like auto plants in the city, having shorter hours, it may not lead to a reduction in production, but it creates jobs for other workers right there in that locality. And that is a not always noticed aspect of what could lead to a demand for shorter hours. There is all kinds of stuff that we produce that we shouldn't produce, and that is bad for us, not good for us. And the military production is a obvious and extreme example. And the whole just transition movement, if you can call it that, trend had its origins in the conversion movement. And the person that was most responsible for initiating the just transition discussion was Tony Mazzocchi, who was a official in the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, who played a central role in developing the idea of conversion from military to non-military production. There's a direct continuity between those two things. And it's one difference to be aware of, and it cuts both ways, is that military production has become so high tech that it's no longer a mass employer to the extent that it was even in the 80s, in the period that you're describing. So on the one hand, there are fewer jobs at stake, and on the other hand, it's less of a problem. Conversion is in a certain way more practical now because the numbers of workers involved is smaller. I don't know exactly what the implications of that are. We're still going to have to figure that out, but it is a factor to keep in mind. But certainly what we're facing now is a ridiculous and horrible drive to have a huge expansion in military production. And I'm personally delighted that the Palestine Solidarity Movement is, among other things, challenging that. And maybe I'll stop there and go on. Who's next?
Yep. Marlon is next.
Hi. Yeah, first I want to say like thank you for like sharing all this like information on the labor movement and its ties to environmentalism and just learning about like all the different struggles that are occurring. Um, my kind of like I guess question comment is like just like listening to things about like the just transition, hearing goals within like coming from like the Green New Deal, it reminds me of like some other like areas within like the environmental like struggles that are going on. Like I think about kind of like the Red New Deal that was proposed by the uh, Red Nation, and kind of like talking about the sort of how a lot of like the transitions that are required will be kind of like dependent on the third world, and how like a lot of the like supplies for batteries and things like that have to be are looked at from countries in Africa or South America, and how like those mining processes destroy the lands over there and also like infringe on like indigenous people's lands, like in any like continent which those struggles are occurring. And even just kind of like the issues around like land pollution, contamination, and those issues of climate crisis that are also, and land theft that were being addressed over at the believes like the indigenous people, like a lot of different delegations from indigenous environmental groups and nations spoke at the UN last month in April for a couple weeks. um yeah, so I guess like my general question is kind of like, is there any kind of like talk about that, like the grappling of kind of like certain contradictions of what is necessary for there to be green energy and kind of like green driving sort of like within North America and like other parts of the world, and kind of the extraction processes of like other peoples where the materials and the supplies are coming from. And I guess too, just like sort of like the labor movement and like the kind of like just transition movement, if there's like any kind of like links also to like indigenous like land struggles over here within the US as well, if there's like any solidarity there.
So, all good points. Specifically on the question of ties to indigenous struggles, I think the most, well, the two great pipeline struggles, the against the KXL pipeline and against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which were probably the two. Well, KXL was definitely the biggest struggle of the environmental movement and biggest environmental struggle of the decade, uh, um, to say the least, were in both cases largely initiated by indigenous groups and involved very substantial leadership from indigenous groups. Another case would be the questions of power plant, the Navajo reservation power, coal-fired power plants, where there was major cooperation between the indigenous groups on the reservation who were trying to shut down the power plants and environmental groups like the Sierra Club. So there's a lot of I think that's one piece of your question covers a lot of different points. That's one piece. We're working with a group that is trying to address the supply chain issues worldwide for auto parts. So auto parts plants are all obviously spread all over the world. They're one of the most globalized industries. And that is trying to, so this network is trying to collaborate internationally with the places where the parts are being produced. And that definitely includes the battery and EV parts. I'm not going to claim that that's yet at the stage where it's having successes, and I'm not going to claim that it is participated in by the entire environmental movement. It's a starting place. The other thing that I would say is that there are undoubtedly destructive aspects that are going to extraction and others that will accompany any kind of production, including the transition to electrification. I think if you look at it either nationally or globally, it's trivial relative to the destruction that's conducted every day by the fossil fuel industry. And if you compared them, I don't know how you would go about comparing them, but the advantages to people all over the world, including the poorest countries and indigenous countries, of making an effective transition to climate safe energy would totally overwhelm the amount of damage that's being done or likely to be done by transition to renewables and other climate protection policies. That doesn't mean that those are negligible and shouldn't be paid attention to. It's exactly like the situation of just transition for workers. The people who are subject to those destructive effects must not be made to pay the price for them. It's totally unjust and unfair that they should. And protecting them and protecting their lands needs to be built in as an aspect of just transition, of what a just transition is, just as it is for workers.
Okay, so we've got a final stack. We're over an hour, so if we can keep questions and answers to like a couple of minutes, that'd be great so we can fit everyone in. So we've got John H. next.
Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, John.
I had a comment and a question. The comment is I've been involved in the Connecticut Roundtable for the amount of time that Jeremy has been involved in it. And I have to tell you, having him on our board is such a great contribution as we go forward. I just want to mention one particular thing. During the Malloy administration, Jeremy looked at the state laws. There was actually a state law that said that the governor had a climate council that he was supposed to work with. And he saw that not only was Malloy not working with the council, but that he had not even populated it. He hadn't appointed anybody to it. And we had a meeting with the governor and with the energy commissioner, Rob Klee, and said, look, you've got this climate change council, you're not even using it, and you ought to be using it. And they said, okay, we'll meet with you in a couple of weeks. They came back, and it was the first time in a meeting with state officials where they came back and they just said, you know what, you're right. We ought to be doing this. And then they said to us, well, what do you think we ought to be doing? And so that moved the roundtable into a position of having a great influence on state policy. And it was a remarkable turn of events, and it really all hinged on Jeremy. The question I have, Jeremy, is if you could just talk a little bit about why just transition needs to be a high road in terms of working people and people of color, that it has to include union jobs and opportunities rather than energy moving into kind of the new Walmart of jobs. Politically, why that's important.
Good question. I'll try to be very, very brief. And I should say that John Harity was not only was the long-term chair of the Connecticut Roundtable on Climate and Jobs, he was the head of the Machinists Union in Connecticut and is responsible more than anyone else for the machinists nationally having passed a very strong resolution on climate change. And also a dear friend. The core problem is that workers look at all this climate stuff and say, the problem is we know our employers and we know that they're going to do everything they can to take advantage of anything like this that comes along, to drive down our conditions and destroy our jobs. And they have very good reason for thinking that way, and also especially to destroy our unions. And so that means that working people are going to be very wary of climate protection policies unless they include, as part of just transition, protection for unions, expansion of unions, and high quality, high road jobs. And that can make all the difference politically in terms of workers saying, you know what, this is good for us. We're really going to back this because it's good for us.
Okay. John, Kay, and Cooper, why don't you give your questions at the same time? We'll let Jeremy answer those.
I'll go first. Okay. Thank you, and greetings from Philadelphia. We're having a watch party here, and so I'm a long-term building trade worker, and I wonder if there's been how much progress there's been in the trades themselves, specifically carpenters, the electricians, and the sheet metal workers on the climate issue, whether or not these unions are taking any position that will help us, move towards a just transition. The second comment I have, just more of a comment, is that I think the extreme heat in the summertime for building trades workers is a sort of wedge that we can use to make this issue more real for these workers. Because I've had conversations with coworkers about this very question, and the idea that our union contract should include the right of stewards to shut a job down when it's too damn hot to work. Well, anyway, that's it for me, and I'll let Cooper say something.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Jeremy, for being with us today, and thanks to everybody for their input. For hearing the way this conversation has been going, it for me comes back to the question of how transition to me, it really comes down to.
Can you get a little closer to the mic?
Excuse me. Pardon me.
Thank you.
What a just transition means, I'm hearing this conversation, is really a question about who gets to decide what the transition looks like. You had mentioned earlier how the auto companies are trying to use the transition to EVs as a way of undermining the unions, tapping the EV package non-union jobs. Even when we talk about fossil fuel production, the production of fossil fuels ends up creating these sacrifice zones for the communities. For example, when they build pipelines, they always put them through communities of color, through indigenous lands, right? So there's always somebody who makes a decision to sacrifice a particular community as you community of color. So it doesn't seem like, policies, for example, Biden's Infrastructure Act doesn't necessarily address this problem of how the decisions are being made about how to use new technologies, how to actually make the transition. So perhaps you could say a couple words about how unions or communities of color could work together and make connections, actually, push forward the just transition themselves. This also comes down to questions related to not necessarily climate directly, but automation as well. We have UPS workers who are facing the threat of increasing automation in their factories, and Amazon workers as well and stuff. So, and in fact, who is making the decision? Is it workers and the communities are affected by it, or is it billionaires? That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
So first,
We have a third question.
We have a third
question.
Yep.
It's very brief. I heard the just transition into similar modes of production, whether it's automobiles into electric vehicles. But doesn't just transition also include what is necessary to mitigate the climate crisis, which is the repair that's needed for the past atrocities that have been done, namely the things that the mining industry has done, where mountaintop removal has just cleared land, and the biodiversity is really at a crisis point. So part of the Green Deal or the Red New Deal or whatever it is to get out of this climate is repairing the harm that has been done. And is that in the conversation of just transition with labor? Sure.
Okay, let me try quick because so all excellent points. So let me go back to the start. So sheet metal workers have a long tradition of supporting, especially solar energy. Carpenters, of course, there's a lot of division in the union in different places, and in I think it's got different locals are very different in their approach, and for electrical workers, in the IBEW, it's really varied from place to place. There are locals in California that are the pioneering climate protection forces in their cities and areas. There are others that are campaigning to prevent the closing of fossil fuel plants. It's extremely diverse in the electricians. But there are certainly locals where it is and I was going to talk about one, but I cut it for time. There are certainly ones where they are a leading force and are seeing it both as an opportunity for jobs and also as a way to create job ladders and access for discriminated against groups to electricians' jobs. Summer heat is also totally on target as something that's, I think, making all of us think. And in the California, just to take one example, it's across unions and across the country, but specifically in the California coalition I mentioned, legislation regarding heat and heat protection rights of workers is part of that campaign. And okay, so on the second point, who gets to decide, all is really at the core of all of these questions. And I think that's one of the exciting things about the UAW strike and actions when I said that they were imposing their plan for the industry on the corporations, that is really central to why it's so exciting and why it's important and what we all need to be doing. And finally, regarding just transition, and I use the term remediation for past damages like the damages of the coal industry. I think that the hiring unemployed people, especially unemployed coal miners and coal industry workers, to remediate the damage of the coal industry has actually been one of the central demands of the environmental and just transition campaigns in the coal fields. So that's a prime example there. In most of the coal plant shutdowns that I'm aware of, hiring workers who worked in the plants and have lost their jobs to do the remediation and transition has frequently been a regular demand, both of the unions and of environmental organizations. So I think that is exactly a direction we ought to be going, and I'm glad that the question was raised. And of course, on all of these, I'm giving examples that are, small, relatively small scale. They're examples of what we need to do on a hugely larger scale.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we have two more people on stack, and then I think Mary also typed in a question. But Stanley and Jocelyn, if you want to quickly ask your questions, and that will be our those will be our final questions. And then just a reminder, we're going to have a quick brief meeting after this talk. So if you want to stick around for that, it'll just be about 15 minutes. So go ahead, Stanley.
My comment is we need to talk more about the big picture points that Chris started to bring up, because we have only till 2030. That's what the scientists say before we go over some of these huge tipping points. And we have to talk about some things that might be uncomfortable for some people, but like a people's takeover of the fossil fuel industries, not just these, battles that we, make a little bit of progress. We don't have time for that. We have till 2030. So I put a couple of links into the chat where some ideas that Promoting Enduring Peace has, and also the Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth that were adopted in Latin America a number of years ago. We got to talk about very big radical changes. If we don't talk about it, who is? I'm done.
Go ahead, Jocelyn, real quick.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for your presentation. My question is on just transition of the war industry and weapons manufacturers specifically to support a green economy. Can you talk a little bit about concrete ways to change power structures in this sector while we just transition? And what I mean by that is to shift power away from like CEOs profiting from war and genocide back to workers and local communities, as well as ways to avoid perpetuating or continuing green imperialism in the global south while we build more renewables.
So, but these are actually quite related questions, I think. And I think the questions of power are crucial. And I have spent most of my life trying to write about this and address this. The part of the reason that organized workers are crucial in thinking about climate protection and changing our relation to the, not just to fossil fuels, but to the entire way we relate to nature, is because the power of the strike and the withdrawal of labor power is a crucial power that people have if they're prepared to use it. And I wrote a book called Strike about 50 years ago about that. On the, how does this apply to climate? The way I've normally talked about it, and it's not on the agenda for this conversation today, but I'd be glad to talk about it with anyone forever under any circumstances. I think we need to have a climate insurgency that is global, that uses the techniques of nonviolent direct action and withdrawal of consent, and that lays its claims on the basis of the absolute right of the people to halt something that is destroying the potentials for future of human life and destroying the actual existing conditions of millions and millions of existing people today, and that requires civil disobedience and a refusal to accept that what the state and the corporations are doing is legitimate. That's why I call it an insurgency. And that's the direction that I think that ultimately we have to go. We also have to face the fact that working people have to make a living day by day. They have to put food on the kitchen table. And that creates a short-term, I don't want to say an interest, because I don't think it really is an interest, but a fear that, well, we may be able to change society in the future, but today climate protection measures are going to threaten my life and livelihood and chance to feed my kids. And we have to recognize that reality, and we have to make addressing that reality a central part of climate strategy. So that's why we have to have that larger picture that Stan referred to absolutely in our minds, and we have to think about what are the means of power we could develop to address it. But we need to recognize that if we go do that without recognizing the day-to-day needs of ordinary people, then we run the risk of creating a very unfavorable polarization against the very things we're trying to accomplish.
All right, thank you so much. I think we should wrap it up. But I really appreciate you taking the time to answer all of those questions. And I put in the Labor Network for Sustainability website again. But yeah, thank you so much. Round of applause if we could do it. So I guess now we will transition to our meeting section of the talk. So yeah, feel free to sign up.
I just want to thank you all for being here and participating in this dialogue. It was a great discussion. I can't believe that we probably discussed this for an hour intensely. It's very intense. And I hope if my answers were far from perfect, that they give people the opportunity to take them and do better. Thank you.
Thank you so much.